To the audit committee meeting. The first item here is approval of the agenda. Are there any additions or corrections to the agenda? Seeing none, can I get a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. The next item here is the. Sorry.
You got a motion in a second, you need to ask for approval.
Oh, sorry. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion passes. The next item is the approval of the February 14th Audit Committee minutes. Are there any additions or amendments to the minutes? Seeing none, can I get a motion to approve?
So moved.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion passes. Our first business item here is the State Auditor's Exit Conference. And we have Stephanie Kuka and Aaron Tree.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Stephanie Kuka. I'm the Audit Director from the Office of the State Auditor. And this is Aaron Tree, who is the lead auditor. On the audit this year, we have passed out draft copies of our management letter and our required communication letter, which should be in front of you. This is a little unique. We haven't issued our report yet, so you have draft versions. We actually have to collect them at the end of the meeting, but you will have the actual report issued by the end of the week. So for now, you just have this draft version that we actually have to take back. But otherwise, I will jump into our report. The first thing that you will see in the packet is the required communication letter. And I'm just going to highlight pieces of this report. I won't read this whole thing to you. So on that first page, it says, we have audited the financial statements of the governmental activities, the business type activities, each major fund, the aggregate remaining fund information of the Metropolitan Council, a component unit of the state of Minnesota for the year ended December 31st of 2022. Our responsibilities under U.S. generally accepted auditing standards and the uniform guidance is to express opinions about whether the financial statements prepared by management with your oversight are fairly presented in all material respects in conformity with accounting principles generally accepted in the United States of America. The second page of that document talks about significant audit matters, qualitative aspects of accounting practices. During 2022, the Metropolitan Council adopted new accounting guidance by implementing the provisions of GASB Statement Number 96, which is subscription-based information technology arrangements. This standard establishes criteria for accounting and financial reporting for subscription-based information technology arrangements. So we just are pointing out that there's this new accounting guidance that was implemented this year. The next section talks about accounting estimates. Estimates are prepared by management and they're based on management's knowledge and experience about both past and current events and also assumptions about future events. And then there's certain estimates that are particularly sensitive because of the possibility that a future event affecting the estimate might differ from what was expected. And so below is a list of the sensitive estimates. All these estimates are the same as last year. They're consistent categories and they were all measured in a method consistent with the last year. So we won't go through all of them. Towards the bottom of the next page, it talks about difficulties encountered in performing our audit. We are happy to report that we encountered no significant difficulties in dealing with management in performing and completing our audit. Under corrected and uncorrected misstatements, professional standards require us to accumulate all known and likely misstatements identified during the audit, other than those that are trivial, and communicate them to the appropriate level of management. Management has corrected all such misstatements. In addition, none of the misstatements detected as a result of our audit procedures and corrected by management were material, either individually or in the aggregate. At the bottom, it talks about disagreements with management. A disagreement with management is a financial accounting, reporting, or auditing matter that could be significant to the financial statements or the auditor's report. And we're pleased to report that no such disagreements arose during the course of our audit. The next page, there's a disclosure about management consultations with other independent accountants. In situations where management decides to consult with another accountant about an auditing or an accounting matter, obtaining a second opinion, we would need to disclose additional information. To our knowledge, there was no such consultation with other accountants this year. Under other matters, it talks about our responsibility for the different sections in the ACFR other than the financial statements and the notes to the financial statements. Our responsibility for the introductory and the statistical sections doesn't extend beyond the financial information identified in our opinion. We read this information and consider whether it or the manner of its presentation is materially inconsistent with the information appearing in the financial statements. We have also applied certain limited procedures to the required supplementary information, which is listed there. Our procedures consist of inquiries of management, comparing the information for consistency with management's responses to our inquiries, the basic financial statements, and other knowledge we obtained during our audit. We did not audit the RSI and don't express an opinion or provide assurance on it. And then the last paragraph talks about the supplementary information, which is listed there as well, and we compare and reconcile the supplementary information to underlying accounting records that were used to prepare the basic financial statements or to the basic financial statements themselves. All right, and then on the next page is our report. This is part of the management and compliance report that we issue. So this is the report on internal control over financial reporting and on compliance and other matters. Under the report on internal control over financial reporting section, we consider the Metropolitan Council's internal control over financial reporting as a basis for designing audit procedures that are appropriate in these circumstances for the purpose of expressing our opinion on the financial statements, but not for the purpose of expressing an opinion on the internal control over financial reporting. So we do not express an opinion on the internal control. The next paragraph talks about a deficiency and defines deficiencies. So a deficiency in internal control exists when the design or operation of a control doesn't allow management or employees to prevent or detect and correct misstatements on a timely basis. A material weakness is a type of deficiency in internal control where there's a reasonable possibility that a material misstatement of the financial statements will not be prevented or detected and corrected on a timely basis. And then the other type of deficiency is a significant deficiency, which is less severe than a material weakness, but it's important enough to merit attention by those charged with governance. The bottom of the page, you'll see we identify a deficiency in internal control described in the accompanying schedule of findings and question costs as item 2022-001, which we consider to be a significant deficiency. So we'll go over that in a little bit. On the following page, it talks about our report on compliance and other matters. The results of our test disclose no instances of non-compliance or other matters required to be reported under government auditing standards. The next section is over Minnesota legal compliance. During our audit, nothing came to our attention that caused us to believe the Metropolitan Council failed to agree with the contracting bid laws, depositories of public funds, public investments, conflicts of interest, claims and disbursements, and miscellaneous provision sections of the Minnesota Legal Compliance Audit Guide for other political subdivisions, which we test in relation to our audit. And then under the Metropolitan Council's response to the findings, just wanted to point out that the corrective action plan isn't included yet in this report, but the corrective action plan includes management's response to the findings, and it's not subject to the auditing procedures applied in the audit of the financial statements. So we don't express an opinion on it. The management's response is their responsibility, and we just look it over to make sure it agrees with the finding, but other than that, it's management's responsibility. The next report is the report on compliance for each major federal program, the report on internal control over compliance, and the report on the scheduled expenditures of federal awards, or the SEPA. So under About 2 paragraphs down, it talks about the qualified opinion on the housing choice voucher cluster. So except for the non-compliance, which is described in the basis for qualified and unmodified opinion section of our report, which is on the following page, the Metropolitan Council complied in all material respects with the compliance requirements referred to above that could have a direct and material effect on the housing choice voucher cluster. And then for all the other major programs we audited, we issued an unmodified opinion. So on the following page, about 2 paragraphs down, it talks about the matter giving rise to the qualified opinion on the housing choice voucher cluster. So as described in the schedule of findings and question costs, the Metropolitan Council didn't comply with the requirements regarding housing choice voucher cluster as described in finding 2022-002 for eligibility, which we will go over in a minute. And compliance with such requirements is necessary, in our opinion, for the Metropolitan Council to comply with the requirements applicable to that program under uniform guidance. About halfway down the page, it talks about auditor's responsibility for the audit of compliance. Our objectives are to obtain reasonable assurance about whether material non-compliance with the compliance requirements referred to above, whether due to fraud or due to error, and we express an opinion on the Metropolitan Council's compliance based on our audit. So below it lists in performing our audit the things that we do. We exercise professional judgment and we maintain professional skepticism. We identify and assess the risk of material non-compliance and design and perform audit procedures responsive to those risks. We obtain an understanding of the Metropolitan Council's internal control over compliance, and we test and report on the internal control over compliance. And then on the next page, under the report on internal control over compliance, it talks again about a deficiency and the definition for a deficiency, significant deficiency, and material weakness, which is consistent with the definition from the financial statement report, so I won't go over them again. But we consider the deficiency in internal control over compliance described in the schedule of findings and question costs as item 2022-002 to be a material weakness. So this is the same finding as the compliance finding. It's just a finding over both control and compliance for the federal program. And then the last part of this report talks about the schedule of expenditures of federal awards, which is required by uniform guidance. This is the summary of all of the federal awards expended by the council during the year. And the very last sentence says, in our opinion, the CFA is fairly stated in all material respects in relation to the financial statements as a whole.
The next section is the schedule of findings and question cost. We issued an unmodified opinion on the financial statements, and then there was no material weaknesses identified and one significant deficiency. For federal awards, there was one material weakness and no significant deficiencies. The major federal programs were the Housing Voucher Cluster, the Federal Transit Cluster, the Highway Planning and Construction Cluster, and the Capitalization Grants for Clean Water State Revolving Fund Cluster. And as Stephanie noted, these were all unmodified opinions except for the Housing Voucher Cluster, which was qualified. The threshold used to distinguish between type A and B was $3 million, and the council did qualify as a low-risk IoT. The first finding is bank reconciliations. Reconciliations are control activities designed to provide reasonable assurance that errors will be prevented and detected in a timely manner and involve the comparison of records or balances from different sources. Effective reconciliations properly account for any differences between the records or balances. During our review of the council's December 2022 bank rec, the auditor was unable to reconcile the bank balance to the Metropolitan Council's general ledger. The bank rec was not completed or reviewed until April 2023, and we tested for additional months in 2022, which were not reviewed by council. Unreconciled amounts fluctuate throughout the year, indicating continued errors or irregularities in the council accounting records. In the 2022 audit, council was able to determine the 2 payroll entries that were made during the year were not recorded in the general ledger. This accounted for a large portion of the year in variance. We were informed that council experienced employee turnover and new staff were assigned to prepare and review the bank recs, but we recommend that bank reconciliations be accurately completed and reviewed in a timely manner that council should continue to review the related accounting records to identify the source of any previous unreconciled differences and resolve them as appropriate, and that additional internal controls should be developed and implemented in response to the identified errors that were allowed to occur. The second finding was the federal award finding for eligibility and source documentation. This was in the housing voucher cluster. Title II of the Code of Federal Regulations states that the auditee must establish and maintain effective internal control over the federal award that provides reasonable assurance that the auditee is managing the federal award in compliance with federal statutes, regulations, and the terms and conditions of the federal award. Per Title 24 of the federal regulations, each member over the age of 18 is subject to a criminal background check prior to admission into the program, and states that for each family member who contends that he or she is a U.S. citizen or a non-citizen with eligible immigration status, the family must submit to the responsible entity a written declaration signed under penalty of perjury by which the family member declares whether he or she is a U.S. citizen or non-citizen with eligible immigration status. This is known as a Section 214 form. And finally, public housing authorities are required by Notice PIH 2010-19 to provide the debts owed to public housing agency and terminations notice to all applicants and program participants over the age of 18. In our sample of 40 case files, there were 7 case files that were missing documentation or evidence that a criminal background check was performed for 1 or more adult members of the household. 2 case files were missing a family member on the status 214 citizenship form, and 4 case files were missing the debts owed form for 1 or more adult members of the household. For context, Housing Pro is the system used by the HRA to calculate the monthly housing assistance payments for the Housing Choice Voucher Program participants and to document and support eligibility determinations. Proper input of information into the system and documentation retention is an important function to ensure accurate and proper eligibility determination and calculations of payments. The deviations we identified did not impact eligibility or result in any incorrect level of benefit amount. But errors in eligibility determining factors increase the risk that a program participant will receive benefits when they are not eligible or are paid to add an incorrect benefit amount. We recommend that the Metropolitan Council implement additional procedures to provide reasonable assurance that all necessary documentation is maintained supporting compliance with federal regulations. The last section is the CFA and the CFA notes. CFA is very similar to last year. For 2022, the total federal awards expended was $668.6 million, and the large majority of that was the federal transit cluster at $521 million. And as I said, last page is no, which is again very standard with the prior years. Is there any questions?
Thank you. Are there any questions from committee members? Committee member Butler.
Thank you, Shirley. So I'm trying to wrap my head around a little bit of the terminology being used here as it relates to the issue found in Section 3 of the Federal Award Findings. So you refer to it as a material weakness, but then also said it did not have any impact on any of the financials or any of the benefits that were actually offered. And I thought you said earlier that the material weakness, to be a material weakness, it would have to have a financial, some level of significant financial impact. So how do I reconcile that in my head? I understand the control deficiency exists and needs to be resolved, but how does that rise to a material weakness?
I guess to clarify, when we define deficiency for financial statements, we use the term for financial purposes, but under compliance, the definition is slightly different.
Okay.
So it's a material weakness in internal control over compliance is a deficiency or combination of deficiencies in internal control over compliance, such that there's a reasonable possibility that material non-compliance with a type of compliance requirement won't be prevented or detected and corrected on a timely basis. So we consider it material because we tested 40 case files and because of the number of issues that came up. It was significant to the sample that we selected. So not necessarily monetarily significant, but in terms of the size that we tested.
Okay. And so it's just the compliance itself that you thought raised to that level.
Correct. There was no financial implication of the finding.
Okay. And then for the qualified versus non-qualified, why would this raise to the qualified?
Qualified?
training?
Our office kind of has some standards for what gets us to the level of it being qualified. It's surely the number of cases that it was. So it was 7 for the first, and it was for these eligibility findings, we kind of considered them in the aggregate. And so it was 7 missing the criminal background checks, 2 missing a family member, and 4 in the debts owed. So just as a whole, we just considered that was significant enough to the program that it would qualify it. I would say if there was just a couple of issues that we noted, then it wouldn't have been qualified, but because of the sheer number, it was.
Any other questions? Councilmember Guptan.
Thank you, Shirley. So is this program, the housing choice vouchers, I'm assuming this is an ongoing program for the
Correct.
council and that you've audited for a number of years?
Correct.
Okay, so is this a brand new finding? Is it a repeat finding? Have you ever had this finding before?
We have not had this finding in recent years. The last time we audited this program was 3 years ago, and we did not have this finding. Beyond that, I guess I can't remember off the top of my head. We've never had a qualified opinion over this program like this before.
Okay. So one other question then, I know the management response isn't in here yet, but any insight as to what happened here and what caused the degradation of the quality?
Well, Terry Smith from our Community Development Division, our Housing and Redevelopment Authority, she can speak to
Thank you.
the response.
Hey, good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I'm Terry Smith. I'm the director of the Council's Housing and Redevelopment Authority. And I think what happened was when the auditors are looking at the forms, there's probably 50 forms that you're looking at for each participant file. And what happened was during the time period when the forms are collected, like we only collect criminal background checks at admission to the program. And during some of these instances, at the period of time when the people were admitted, we were in a process change, and so there was a box on the bottom of the form that the criminal background check was checked. And for example, the staff member mischecking the box, although the form that was in there. So there was no proof that a background check was completed. For the debts owed, it was missing a signature. Those forms were just missed. It's one of the federal forms of about 20 in each file. So as the director of this program, I'm not super concerned about it. We already have a remedy in place. We've created a new checklist that will be in every single file that makes sure, probably has 35 line items to make sure that all the forms are checked. And then that will go through our general audit process to make sure that this doesn't occur in the future. Do you concur with that?
Yes, and I think too, some of these forms, like Terry said, are from years ago when people were accepted onto the program. So at some point in time, files got scanned to be electronic, and so some files were also just lost in that process.
Thanks, Terry. Any other questions?
I have a question, Chair Lee, thank you. Will the material weakness and modified opinion mean that the Met Council is a high-risk auditee next year?
Yes. Yes, which means that we will be required to test 20% of the federal programs rather than 40. I will say that usually we do anyways, just because of the size of the programs. So it might not actually affect what we would have chosen anyways, but yes.
Go, Councilmember Jones.
Thank you, Chair Lee. And then will this program then be audited next year or will it just go into the regular rotation?
Yes, it will be audited again because it was qualified.
Any other questions? Yeah, Councilmember Gillespie.
Thanks, Shirley. Just to clarify, did you say it would go up to 40% from, or up to 20% from what?
Up to 40%, we have to test 40% of the federal programs versus 20%.
Okay, versus 20. Okay, that makes sense.
Any other questions, comments?
Chair Lee, members of the committee, I just want to add that both of these two topics, we actually have it on our audit plan as potential topics, and so I think this will probably instigate us thinking about maybe doing that a little sooner than we would have normally. So have some additional audit coverage. I know the state auditor, when they do their work, draws a relatively small sample, and we probably go bigger and a little deeper and try to address some of the issues that came up to see if they were isolated or whether it was improvements that we made. So just wanted to add that for context.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, comments? All right, seeing none, thank you, Stephanie. Thank you. Our next business item is number 2, which is the risk assessment and audit plan. And Director LaTour.
I'll give everything a minute to settle after we lost half our audience. Try the second half of that night. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, so second business item, and first we'll ask you to vote on is an update to our annual audit plan and risk assessment. As you may remember from the last time we approved this audit plan in December, we've adjusted our audit plan to be really more of a 6-month plan with an outlook rather than a year plan, really just based on experience that a year out, it so much changes during the course of a year that it just makes sense to keep coming back with this on more of a repetitive cycle. So this isn't a full update. There's some tweaks, some places where we took some things out that we finished and added one item. We'll ask for one item to be added. And also I thought it'd be important to go through a few, again, not a full risk assessment. We didn't do any work on this, but there's some items that I think are just worth raising to the committee's attention that have affected the risk profile of the council throughout the year. So I'll talk a little bit about that to start. The first thing, and probably, sorry, this is a little small, but the 2023 legislative session was a very impactful one for the council. And people at this table that could speak much better to the impacts of this than I can at this point. A lot of this is still relatively new, but there are some big changes that happened. I added just a short list of bullet points. A 3/4-cent sales tax for Metropolitan Transportation starting this fall for transitway operations, maintenance, and capital projects, just a significant source of funding for us. That you know the numbers off the top of your head, but it's like $300 million the first year and $700 million, something like that.
They're still calculating what the numbers are, but it's a lot. We went from being in an operational structural deficit to at least now having ongoing funding, but additional requirements and things we have to pay for too. So there's a lot of accounting being done right now to figure out how that all plays out.
Right, and just the numbers, unpredictable, right? Just saw yesterday that the Viking Stadium, People's Stadium, was paid off 20 years early because the revenue generated from that sales tax. So, but that was actually for other sources. But certainly will change the profile of how we fund in transit in the region for decades to come. Some new reporting requirements around budget, around safety and security. I won't go through all that today, but if you're interested, there's some presentations out there I can post in your SharePoint file if you want to go through more detail to hear about it, or we can arrange to have Judge Shetman, our legislative affairs representative, come in and tell you more about all of these changes.
There was great presentations at TAP from both Met Council and from MnDOT that I think provides a more holistic picture. So maybe, Jen is quite familiar with, and that might be the good presentations to send out to the committee.
Yeah, we can work on that after getting some more materials. A couple other things, fare elimination pilots. We have 2 bus routes that we're going fare free for a period of time to see what the impacts are operationally on funding, on ridership. That'll also affect, because of federal requirements, that'll also affect some Metropolitan mobility riders that are in those corridors, that they will be able to ride free as well. And that, we had a legislative session ends at the end of May. Some of these, including that requirement, were due July 1st. So there is some of this that is already well underway. And I think for council action this week even. Money for a study to look at a North Star extension to St. Cloud, which obviously would affect North Star, could affect North Star in the long run. And then administrative citations and funding for new transit officials, which will change how we approach fare evasion, which is something that I'll talk about a little bit in my next presentation. We have an audit on fare evasion that we've been kind of holding out follow-up because we kind of knew this probably was going to happen at some point. So, and it will affect just the sort of risk profile around fares and safety. So, major changes coming, a lot to do for the council. a lot to do for staff. The other thing I just wanted to highlight is while we have all these new sources of funding, new requirements, we are at a time of significant change in terms of leadership at the council. So I don't have any sort of big story to tell here, but I think it's worth just highlighting for the committee the number of senior positions that are currently vacant or in acting profile. So the regional administrator, the chief financial officer, chief human resources officer, director of real estate, director of risk management. That's just for RA. I highlighted the positions. One thing to note is Phil Waljasper, who's on vacation this week, is covering, I think, 5 of these boxes. So it's a significant time of change and a lot of hiring that'll have to take place in the coming weeks. So this is regional administration, Metro Transit. We still have the general manager vacant. New position, executive director of regional transit capital. It's a recent announcement by Chair Zelli, and that will be a new hire. Deputy Chief Operations Officer Maintenance, same position, transportation, director of bus transportation, and that is not an exhaustive list. I've seen a plan as recently as yesterday for how they're going to use some people in acting positions, and actually I think it's pretty innovative to advertise to staff to apply for interim positions, so 6-month positions to take over extra leadership positions, so that are people that are qualified with Metro Transit. And then the last area I'll focus on is information services. So this is not a holistic list, and I think Craig's in here somewhere behind the poll, but I think the number is 36% of IS staff is turned over in the last, I don't know if that's a year or 2 years. But then here's a list of, and Craig, speak to this if you want to, or if you just want me to say, it's a lot of positions, and so, and significant ones. So there's a couple of reasons I bring this up. Obviously when you have people stretched over positions, you have vacancies, that creates risk. I'll highlight too that one of the things I know this committee has been really asking a lot of questions about is follow-up. It impacts the ability of management to respond to audit findings and to adequately drive change and implement new controls. So no one's making excuses. No one has come to me and said that's why we're slower than. But I think it's pretty obvious when you look at these gaps in the leadership chain that it's going to have an impact at some point. And I think it's been building over time and continues. The other point I'll make about this is the flip side of risk is always opportunity. And we'll have a lot of once we get through a lot of this hiring, and it should be worth pointing out too that one of the key cogs is missing is the Chief Human Resources Officer, which is the person you'd expect to be leading a lot of these hires. So that's created an extra layer of risk. But once we get through all of this, we'll have a lot of new energy, a lot of new ideas, and I think a lot of us that are still here are very motivated to take on these challenges that the legislature has put in front of us to make the organization reach a better place. So I'll just go take questions at the end too if you want. So this is the audit plan in a list form. I'm just going to flip through this because it's repetitive, but here is the ongoing audit work that we have. The one change that I'm asking really to add to the audit plan, and I emailed you all about this in between, is unemployment insurance. This was an audit we added. There was some internal reporting about, if you know anything about unemployment insurance, the past 3 years has been chaotic times, really, about the simplest way to put it. A lot of fraud, a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of misreporting of UI, and requirements that changed by the feds. I didn't even realize this. We stopped being billed by the state for a period of 1.5 years, I think, for our share of unemployment insurance, and then they billed us all at once at the end. It's been a really, really crazy time. So we saw some effects popping up, thought it was important to take this on. We think we can do it pretty quickly anyway. So we decided to just jump on and take it as long as we were working on the topic at the time. So other things that we're picking up, you'll hear a lot about the reports we finished later, so I won't dwell on that, but the other things, we continue to work on contract administration, continue to look at Southwest change orders, and we're working on the gold line architectural and engineering contract. Continue to look at IT lifecycle management, looking at grants at Metro Transit. We're supporting the Metro Transit cash room in they're building a new facility. And we are just beginning to look at body worn cameras, something that's been on the audit plan for a while. We've started to engage in that work. Some things in the next 6 months to continue. MCUB, which is likely something we'll pull up soon, although there's an equity audit going on that will overlap, so we have to determine whether we can fit, some work that isn't repetitive or redundant. Fuel management, bank account reconciliation, which I mentioned, stock rooms, AP. AP is another area we've done a lot of work. You'll hear about it today. Not necessarily an AP audit, but it comes up a lot in terms of contracting. IDASH, recruiting and hiring, HRA, which I mentioned earlier, and then at the end of the year, we always do our North Star audit. The longer term look, I haven't added much to this yet, but we probably will in the fall. Risk management process review, it's kind of like to look at internal controls, Metro Transit customer complaint response, cloud computing, and builder, which supports our project offices. And then a list of other things. This hasn't changed much from the last time. This is just other things we did. So with that, I will take any questions and ask for a vote to approve the amendments to the audit plan.
Thank you, Shirley. So in our packet, Matt, you talked about the contract administration and the bank account reconciliation as being co-sourced types of audits. Can you just expand on that just a little?
Yeah, Shirley, members of the committee. As I mentioned last meeting, we are looking into securing contracts to expand our ability to co-source. We really haven't done a lot of co-sourcing other than for investigations in the past. We've done some IT-related investigative work we've done through co-sourcing. I'm actually, this week I'm going to finish the request for proposal work to put out in the street, and primarily this will be a lot of the work that we'll do will focus around construction auditing with all of the major capital projects, all the new funding we have. We think it's important to have that. The thing I think that would be the advantage of having a third party is it's scalable. As these projects go up and down, we can focus resources without having to add 5 staff. All that comes with that, and then have 5 staff that we then, when a project winds down, too many. So the idea was with a couple of these audits, and bank reconciliation is one where it gets into a little bit of forensic accounting. I think we've made some, I don't speak too far on this, but we have some better sense of what's going on with the bank reconciliation, so we might be able to avoid that. But the idea was to have somebody who can go in and do a little more in-depth accounting than we currently have on staff to deal with the resources. So. Okay.
And then just one question and then a comment. So could you remind me again what MCUB and IDASH are? And then a comment on these is that it might be nice to have just a little bit more of a project description for some of these rather than just the statement and just kind of understanding a little bit where you're going with this. So.
Sure. MCUB is our program. So if you know what a DBE is, Disadvantaged Business Entity.
Okay.
That is a program the federal government operates to ensure that a disadvantaged business entity, and somebody may know the definition better than I do, but it's basically women and minority-owned businesses. Okay. It's to ensure that women and minority businesses get a certain percentage of the work that goes out for federal contracts. Where MCUB picks up is for non-federal contracts. It's basically the same program, but it focuses on for state funding.
And the certifications that there's a definite certification process that businesses have to go through some, even though there could be other businesses that qualify, they don't always want to go through the certification process. With the MnDOT program, that is a program we stood up that expanded that universe, and so utilized other certifications that they use for other processes to make it a little bit easier and try and bring more businesses into the fold.
So do you work at all with the Department of Administration's Disadvantaged Economic Vendor program up with the Department of Admin to help source?
I don't. Is Jody here?
We love when the experts are in the
It's always good.
I see you all lined up behind the poles.
I know.
I can't see it. I get how this
Trying to
works
hide.
out. Chairs are moving next meeting.
Chair Lee, council member, can you just make sure I understand, please restate the question?
So the Minnesota Department of Administration, they have a whole office that's dedicated to, kind of enhancing and expanding the pool of economically disadvantaged vendors. So I'm just curious if that council actually works with that resource at all.
And Chair Lee, council member, we definitely do work collaboratively and coordinate with the Office of State Procurement, which is in the Department of Administration. They maintain their own lists. The council and many other government agencies such as the Metropolitan Airports Commission, Hennepin County, Ramsey County, City of Minneapolis, City of St. Paul, City of Minneapolis School District also participate in their own certification program, which is very similar to the state of Minnesota, and it's really just a little bit different acronyms. However, it's very similar, and I know for our team in procurement and the Office of Equity and Equal Opportunity, we're in constant conversation with their chief procurement officers and some of their procurement managers and their acquisition management specialists as they talk about to share lists and to find information and to make sure as we're moving forward, even with our own separate programs, that they're consistent and equitable, and we're getting a broad reach with those vendors.
Thank you. Committee member, Barbara.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just have a question on the 12 to 18 month you have risk management process review. As you know, we're standing up a different kind of risk management process with sort of the enterprise risk and also the transit ways advancement policy, which has a risk management element to it. Is your intention to include some of that in here, even though it still may be kind of in process of being set up?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Barber. It's a good question. So what I mean with this is actually Phil's team, workers' comp, those processes. I'm very involved in enterprise risk management to the extent it's been moving forward. So two separate kind of issues, but related, right? I mean, when you go through and do a process review, and part of this is to try to identify where those think controls are. Part of that is identify risks and leading to enterprise risk management. So they're related, unrelated.
I think it should be like on your longer term look, because we have the policy, now we're starting to implement it with projects, and it's going to be a lot of, did we accomplish what we intended to accomplish with it? Did we ask the right questions? Those sorts of things.
Yeah. Great.
Any other questions? Matt, I had one comment. In the last couple of months, we've had at least two incidences that I recall where there were acts of violence caught on tape on our transit systems, and at least two videos were leaked to the public. And I know our Metro Transit Chief of Staff, Leslie Canderas, said that we're trying to find out if the persons who leaked it was one of our people. And I feel like it's disturbing to know that it could have been our people, and I just want to make sure we get a handle on that, because we have to make sure our policies and protocols are followed so that things like that don't continue to violate the rights and privacy of crime victims.
Yeah, Charlie, I think I agree with the concern over the video. I know there's been a lot of community concern in the latest case from the impacted community about the release of that video. There are two areas for our team I will just speak to. I don't want to speak entirely for the organization, but for our team, we're looking at two areas of video. One is the body cam audit, another with cash room that involves surveillance video. And in both cases, we're going to be looking at sets of controls around user access, audit logging, to ensure that we know and have the right protections around video and can identify who is doing what. Now, some of this video ends up being in the public realm. It's not always not public. That doesn't mean that it should be released when it's released. And it should be released through the proper channels. I think it's an important topic. I think that we've got a couple of areas where we're going to get a lens into this, and I think we can establish through that work some best practices and identify some ways to help make sure that our video is secure. So I appreciate the question, something that is definitely on our minds.
Couldn't remember, Barbara.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And these are active investigations and also involve, because video is captured on our systems, it gets transferred to the local investigating authorities. So there are investigations going on at multiple touch points throughout the process, both internally and externally.
Any other questions or comments? All right, seeing none, I will seek a motion to move Matt's risk assessment audit plan.
So moved.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, that passes. Next, we will go to our reports. And our first report is the director's report, and once again, Matt.
All right. Well, this is usually we have so much little business to do at the beginning. This is what I'd like to welcome everyone. It's good to see you all in person. And welcome Councilmember Dolkar to your first meeting. Appreciate you joining us. In fact, could I just get some of the external members, actually all the external members, just introduce yourselves really briefly for her benefit, just so she knows who you are.
Sure.
Sorry.
Aimee Jorgensen, in my other life, I'm the Chief Audit Officer at Minnesota State Colleges and Universities.
Gracie George. I am a risk and compliance manager for Brynna, which is a consulting firm.
Quinn Galswick, Chief Auditor for the University of Minnesota.
Hunter Rothler, Chief Auditor for Hennepin County.
I think you know the council members, so for brevity. So a couple things I just wanted to mention in my director's report about the committee before I get to some of this other business. I forwarded along a line edited version of the audit department charter and the audit committee charter for your review. Take some time with it. We have time to update these, but I think it's important at least once every 4 years to go through and make sure that these are up to date. I think what we can do is sometime between now and I'd like to have the council approve, the full council, the audit committee charter. And at that time, I'll probably, with Chair Lee's help, do some sort of presentation for the full council that can sort of bring forward. And I'll talk a little bit about this presentation. But what I'm going to show you today is a roadshow. It's essentially like our telling our story, something we've been working on. We can bring different audiences so we can talk a little bit with the full council about the committee and the work, the department's work. So, and then we would come back in the fall meeting that we have, and if we're ready, we'd approve the department charter at that time. So there's certainly some time to look at this. I'll just highlight a couple things in the meeting. So there's a lot of changes. They're all line edited, so you can see what's been updated. I think that at a high level, looking at the committee charter, I borrowed the committee's charter from the IIA, Institute of Internal Auditors charter, sample charter. That can mean a lot of things for different organizations. I think the way this committee plays out, meeting quarterly and hearing about reports and offering advice, I think it is more of an advisory committee than an oversight. I just think that term fits a little better. So I'm trying that out to see what you think. Please provide feedback if you think otherwise. I think one of two things probably, if it continues to be a quarterly meeting like this, it probably should be advisory. If it wants to be oversight, it's probably more of a regular meeting, honestly. So just consider that. And then I think just considering in the committee's charter the role for emerging issues like ERM and IS security that we've been bringing to this committee, but it's not necessarily reflected specifically in the charter. And also just if there's people that others than me, there's people in the back that are usually always here. If there's others that you'd like to hear from more frequently, we can do that in this venue. So thinking about what might be in there in terms of what should be kind of the function. As far as the department goes, really kind of looking ahead, we've used the term consulting in IA parlance for a long time. I know I've struggled a little bit with what that really means for us. We do a lot of different things. Not all of it fits into a bucket of what I call consulting. So we've been playing with those terminologies. And the IA looks like they're moving in their new standards, the term advisory services. So I'm kind of getting ahead of the game a little bit. The standards are still exposure, but so looking at that, looking at my responsibilities, CAE, reporting the committee, the list is really just reorganized. It's a lot of the same content, but it's here's the things I should be doing annually, here's the things that should be periodical. The idea, you'll see the presentation today, is to try to wrap all of that in there. So things you maybe haven't heard as much about, like budget, that you're make sure that you're hearing about budget, things like that, and staffing levels. And then, as I mentioned, just consideration about whether the audit committee should be reporting, to the full council more often, or just getting regular cadence, or having time here we do some sort of presentation, like some feedback on what would make sense and what council members would appreciate that.
Mr. Chair, I'm just, so like our investment committee reports, we get a report quarterly to the management committee, and at least that at a minimum would be good.
Okay. Yeah, I think even just coming up with a report from each meeting doesn't have to be long, but that it happened, and here's what we talked about. We can work on that together. Okay. And then just one last thing is tomorrow at 9 a.m. They'll be hearing in the Legislative Audit Commission, the second Southwest report will be issued. I can't talk a lot about it yet because it's not public until issued, but a lot of attention. I worked quite a bit with Judy Randall on this audit. She's more than willing and has before come to the council to talk about the results of that work, their work, and has offered such with the Southwest work. I've talked to Chair Zelli about possibilities, what the right room and venue and what we came up with might make the most sense as a committee of the whole meeting, and then inviting our external members to attend along with the full council, and doing it on a Wednesday afternoon. So we're working on scheduling that. We have the committee of the whole are very packed agendas, so hopefully they'll come and they'll work with the external members to see what might make sense. So just want to highlight that. All right, back to our team. We have 2 new full-time staff, Aimee, Gillespie, and Tunde Kloster. Congratulations to them, they're both here. They were both interns last year and performed very well, and we went through a competitive process, and the 2 of them emerged out of that competitive process. So we were very happy, and the continuity was great, and they've been just excellent. Replacing them, we have 2 new interns, Devin Leeson and Jared Favilla, back row. They are settling in well. It feels like we're jumping in. Our intern program has really been I think half of our team is former interns. It's really been a great recruiting strategy for us and continues to be. So we're real happy with Jared and Devin. So that leaves us with 11 of 12 full-time equivalents filled. So we're going to work on the last hire sometime in the fall. And then just also noting a couple of accomplishments. Kevin Neely and Tim Larson both recently completed their certified internal auditor exams. I can speak to, I know Quinn can speak to, it is a long, difficult process to get through and takes a lot of dedication. So we're real proud of Kevin and Tim for completing that work. And Julie Quayle is also just finishing up the council's project manager development program. So building our certifications and experience. Okay, so I'm going to go through the rest of the front page and then roll into the presentation. And then hopefully I'll stop talking sometime today and get to the actual work. I think just the significance of the external audits is just the quantity of them right now. State auditor you just heard from, there are still 2 legislative auditor pieces of work going on related to Southwest. There's another one related to Metro Mobility that was just authorized and has started. The FTA will be here next August for drug and alcohol compliance review. Housing and Urban Development was here last 2 weeks ago. Audit looking at emergency review, looking at emergency housing vouchers. MnDOT continues to look at our indirect cost rate process, and MPCA has inspections of Blue Lake and Hastings this week. So just it's a lot, and our office helps coordinate at various levels with all of this. I already went over most of our existing audit work, so I'm going to jump into the presentation. There are a lot of slides here. I'm going to go pretty quickly through this just for time's sake. But I left a lot of them in just to give you a flavor of what this is going to look like for other audiences, but it's things you know. So org chart. I'll talk a little bit about where we sit in the organization, organizational independence, our role just within RA, slide with our team, there's us in the picture, what we do. So we go through the internal, external auditing, investigations. We have some procedures we work on. We do a lot of special projects. This is that consulting and advising piece. And then we look at overhead rates as well. This is the purpose statement that's in the audit charter. So kind of relevant right now, but I think objective assurance and consulting to add value and improve Metropolitan Council's operations. The mission, objective assurance, advice, and insight. I think what I'll talk about a lot here is that not just an auditor, right? We're here to problem solve. We're here to help. We're here to work through and improve the organization. And as Jody well knows, we're always sort of looking forward. Like, yes, we have findings, but let's work together and move forward and find a solution. So trying to get that out more than just we're bean counters. I think to that point, there are a lot of things when I say I'm an auditor, people, most of the time, they're like, oh, you look at my taxes. And I'm like, I wouldn't know how to do that. You wouldn't want me to do that. Don't ask me to do your taxes. But there's a lot of, MPCA, FTA, the state auditor. We all have different roles. We all answer to somebody. In my case, in all of ours, Charlie Zilli signs our checks too. We're all part of the same organization, and we're here to, sort of achieve the same goals. Whereas these other auditors, they have a different mission and objective. And so I'll talk a lot about what the different roles are, what we're here to do. That's basically saying that. This is the audit committee part, quarterly meetings, key roles are approving the audit plan, strategic planning, advice, follow-up, I'll talk through a lot of those pieces. And obviously having the advantages, which I tout a lot, of having external members sitting on the audit committee to help. So this is something new. So this is our budget over the last, it's budget and actual FTEs over the last few years. And this is really since 2019 was my first full year in this position. So we've grown from 7 to 12. I think that we were understaffed when I first took over. I think that I would say when we hit 12, I think we'll be about right, especially with some co-sourcing solutions at our disposal for now. I mean, that's not to say that we wouldn't, I reevaluate that every year, but our budget has also grown from about 900,000 to 1.75 million. Obviously, there's some inflationary factors in there. Staff drives most of that increase, but there are some things that have changed. We used to share contracts for investigations with HR. We don't do that anymore. We have our own contracts and we charge our own contracts within our department. So there's some things that we've taken on internally that we used to shift out. And then obviously looking ahead, I think the next big driver of our budget would be that forensic accounting, construction, auditing services that we procure. But I still think we probably, the budget would look a little bit higher. I think that contract is $500,000, so it's not even over a couple of years, so it's not even a significant driver necessarily, but it will increase. So I feel good about where we are. I don't think just for the independence purpose, I don't feel like we've ever been constrained necessarily by anybody in the organization with growth, whatever I've needed, as long as it's justified, I've been given, so. One of the things I think we should be talking about are qualifications as a department. So if you can understand how to read this, there are 10 people in our department, every line is a person. Each access point, so more than 5 years of audit experience is a qualification, more than 10 years of professional experience, advanced degrees, professional certifications. So what this tells you is that blue line in the middle is the total number of us that has any one of those, meets those criteria. So 8 advanced degrees, 4 people with professional certifications, although Kevin's got 2, Tim's got 2. So if we added those up, we'd have more. More than 5 years of audit experience, I think that's a 7, and a professional is 6. So, so this is just a way of looking at what the qualifications of our department are, and I think identifies that yes, we would probably like to have more people with professional certifications. I'm looking over to my right if there's interest in pursuing such things. This is for other audiences, kind of what guides our work, our charters, our policy, the internal auditor standards, the risk assessment, which we talk about pretty frequently in this committee. One thing I think is a bit of theme around a lot of executive groups that I've been involved with recently is transparency, accountability for our work, how we're achieving our objectives, efficiency, effectiveness. So the next few slides are a way of trying to gauge a little bit around that. So it's as I mentioned before, we're starting to track our time more specifically to projects, and really reporting probably a little more aggregately than we record, but thinking about what and how we spend our time, and making sure that that's in alignment with how others, like with this committee and with senior management, how they think we should be spending our time. So this chart, if you've seen a ribbon chart, it might be hard to understand if you've never seen one before, but the green is the audit, the big green. So that's the time we spend on audits. The big orange is administration. So that's like kind of our non-audit. It's just, it's kind of keeping all the functions you do that isn't charged specifically to like an audit that our staff would do. And then there's other ribbons at the bottom that kind of gives you an order of magnitude. Like we do spend most of our time doing audits. Then there's a bit of time we do with administrative activities. And then at the bottom, what I'll highlight is like the blue on the left, that's when we go into risk assessment season. So you can see the impact that it has, and just slows things down a little bit when we get into that time where we have to go around and develop our audit plan. So we put a lot of investment into it, I think is what that says. But it's relatively short. There's some gearing up for a few of us, and then almost everybody's involved for a month, and then it tapers and you write a plan and move on. Training, I think, the 2 months in the middle, that's December and January, which I think all of you can understand is just a little bit different. I mean, there's the holiday season in there and a lot of vacations. And so you see the audit work, there's not as many people around to take meetings, and we're not all here. So you get a little more administrative time. You also see training, so people are taking advantage of that time to do training and some other things. Highlight on the right, there's a little red ribbon. That's follow-up. So you can see we had an audit committee meeting, and this is just the first half of June. So I asked people to do follow-up, and they did. And you can see that reflected there. I'll talk a little bit about that later. So just a way of showing like what our department in aggregate is doing. And I should say external audits is like on my ribbon, that's a lot, but it doesn't show up as much in the team because I'm only one person. Divisionally, this I think is interesting. This is just this year, but broken down about half of our time on regional administration and our multi-division projects. And really, you think about regional administration, it all gets allocated out, so that's kind of all the divisions. Metro Transit, our biggest singular division focus. Southwest alone, pretty significant piece of the pie, so that's just looking at change orders, that's just us. So if anybody ever says Southwest isn't audited frequently. And then environmental services is relatively small. Something I've been wanting to change for a long time and trying to figure out how to do that has been challenging. This just, I think, is an exemplary of like the project life cycle, right? It's, so the top one is IS contracts. So you can see a lot of time spent on that project, gearing up before the holiday, and then kind of drops off during that January timeframe and then gears back up. But it just shows you the life cycle of a project. Because I think we get a lot of questions about why is this taking so long? And a lot of times it's just other priorities. And what this tells me is just it gives you that kind of lens into, well, there was a few months in there where we were working on other things, right? And it wasn't like we were wasting council money on just spinning wheels. Just a couple examples. And property room being a relatively small audit that, a little bit of investment over a month or two, and then it's pretty minimal outside of that. So these are kind of metrics that I'll be looking at and want to be able to show other people about, this is how we spend our time. These are just some reports, and I won't dwell on this too much because this is all what you're going to hear about next. On the follow-up piece, some of the things that we've been able to close are contract negotiation audit a little bit ago, a couple of meetings ago. We've been able to close those recommendations. Regional parks, we've gotten pretty close to all of them, if not all of them. Quality management services, which is a Southwest light rail oversight contract, so a very important piece of that project. And those audits have been closed out. or those recommendations have been closed. Brynna handed me this 10 minutes before the meeting, so I hadn't even seen it, but this is the status of the recommendations, so this is on the fly. So what this will tell you is, Brynna can jump in if I can't read it, but the green is
recommendations that have been implemented, orange those that are not implemented, and then we also have partially implemented that we're using for some now. For example, for one of the audits you will hear about more later, there's been some action on management side, but there might be an external factor that limits our ability to confirm that it's been fully implemented yet. And as expected, a lot of recommendations from 2022 and from this year are still not due.
right. So we'll plan on developing
Mr.
this.
Chair, does closed not implemented mean that the risk was accepted on those findings? Basically, is that what that?
That is generally what it means. We have not, I have to check again what that is. We have not really developed a risk acceptance procedure. I think that that's something I flagged for Phil Jasper as we develop enterprise risk management, because I think that if you don't have a very good definition of risk tolerance in an organization, it gets challenging to do risk acceptance. Once we get enterprise risk management developed, then we'll be able to better tie that out. At this point, I think what we're saying is that if something hasn't been done in 4 years, we're just going to close it. And I'll do some more background on this in the next meeting. We'll talk about what those are.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Like we talked before, I do risk management but for the medical device industry. There's a category out there for that. It's as low as reasonably practicable. Like you get to a point that you've mitigated something enough that there's enough in place that no matter where you're at, benefits are still above the risk level, and there's got to be some way we can fractionally build something like that into this.
Do you know what they are? Okay.
Could you repeat the question?
As low as said, it wasn't a question, it was how we do it in medical devices. There's a category called as low as reasonably practical. Like you've reduced risk to as low of a level, but it still may be on your register, but there's tools and but there's practices that are out there that do that sort of thing, which would make sense.
Chair Lee, members of the committee, towards the comment about recommendations closed not implemented, with those ones in particular, they related to review of a contract for a subcontractor. That contract was closed, not reissued, so.
Thanks for that. I know we would have talked about this, but it was a contract that was terminated for a subrecipient. So you would have heard about it quite a bit ago. We just didn't follow up because there's no contract left. But we do have a few. Fair evasion, like I mentioned earlier, is still out there. Our technology governance, that's still out there, but we have to kind of wait for some key positions to fill. And so there's a few that I think we need to go towards risk acceptance. We need to talk about how we're going to close them out, but we also probably need to wait for a few things to happen before we do have that conversation. So more to come on this. I would like to develop this a little more, but I think we're trying to develop how we talk about this and close things out. So. I'm just going to skip through this for now. We've talked about this before, but this is our categorization of our findings. But it's you see the big block of red that used to show that we had a lot of subrecipient audits that were compliance based, and now we're shifting away from that and getting into business processes and operations, which I think is where we should be. So this is just another graphical representation of that. And in the full presentation, if I had more time, I would talk a little bit more about what all this means and how they roll up, but I want to respect that we've got 5 reports still. So some other things we're working on. This is a demonstration of our ethics point reporting. I'll just mention this briefly, but this is the reporting we've been doing internally. These are just our issues, the ones that come to audit. We've had 28 in the last, this is 2.5 years or so. 8 outsourced investigations, and I think a key point too is the 5 that we've taken a complaint and turned it into something that resembles more of an audit, which I think sometimes is more appropriate, honestly, than, it just depends, and sometimes it's both. So I will go into more of this detail next time. But just to show you that we're really working hard on getting this consistent. This is a key metric here that I think will turn a new metric for us. Average days to close a complaint. So how many days from the time we get a complaint does it take to fully resolve that complaint? 68 days, which depends on your lens, may seem long, but sometimes these investigations take quite a while. And those skew a lot of that result. So on the whole, I'm pretty satisfied with that number. Strategic plan, I will go through this next time in more detail. I've started to develop some key performance indicators, which is how we'll tie out this presentation. Eventually, we'll be really just going through the KPIs, using some of these charts and graphs. Other activities we're doing, quite a bit of other things, including the local government audit roundtable. Participated with some of the people in this room. And looking ahead, expansion of third-party resources we talked about, strategic plan, and then our peer review, self-assessment, and validation is due next year. So looking forward to that. Questions?
Any questions from me?
Chair, yes, and Matt. First of all, I just wanted to congratulate Kevin and Tim for that accomplishment in terms of getting their certification. I think it's really, really important that the more people that have that on your team, the better. What I'm wondering about is whether or not the council supports the expenses that are associated with that for our staff.
Yeah, Chair Lee, members of the committee, we do support learning materials, and then we also will support at least one truck.
Yeah.
Right?
Thank you, that's great.
Councilman, Committee Member.
Thank you. So I have a couple of items. Thankfully, Indra has my first one. But going back to the questions on the charter, changes to the charter, and the audit committee's policy related to the audit committee. I know you said that we have time for feedback, but open to some initial impressions or comments on that.
100%.
So from the move from oversight to advisory, where I get a little uncomfortable with that is the functional reporting line to the audit committee. I think it's really important that you have a functional reporting line to the audit committee and not to the administration, both for IA standards, but also just as a level of practicality. So I worry about it just in that term. Other places where you've made that change, it didn't really bother me as much, but there's one place where you moved it from oversight to the internal and external audit function to review. And so that'd be one thing that's just one of my initial reactions to it. For the change in the frequency of looking at the audit charter was the other one that I had initial reaction to, where I'm fully supportive of not doing that annually. However, I think the IAA standards, at least currently proposed, are going to push us to do that annually. I think they're going to. But I think you're right that I don't see much value in it, doing it every year, unless there is something that needs to be brought to us. But that might be something that'll have to be looked at when those changes hit.
I think we can look at that as there's sort of a wholehearted, repetitive review, and then there's, let's bring this to the committee and see if we see anything that needs to change and improve it. Yeah, there's a compromise between those two, we can meet the standard. Yeah, appreciate that you bring that up though.
And then one more question. So completely other area. So related to the OLA report, I know that you can't speak to the new one that is coming out, but one thing I was concerned about from the previous report was the comment of them feeling that there was a slow response process from the council, that some of their work was being impeded. Do you feel confident that that has changed, or is there additional steps that the committee should be thinking about to make sure that we're complying with those requests in a timely manner?
Yeah, Chair Lee, members of the committee, it's a really good question, and be careful how I answer this, but the volume and request of information for that project far exceeds anything I've ever seen before. Far exceeds it, there's just a lot of information. It's a very complicated project, and to my knowledge, the OLA had never encountered a construction project like this. And auditors, as we all know who are auditors, our job is to learn things very quickly. Construction auditing, I've been doing Southwest work for 7 years, and I still don't think I even remotely understand everything that happens on that project. It's just a very steep learning curve. I've asked Auditor Randall directly if she thinks that we've improved. The reality between February and today is that there has been far less interaction. Like, they had most of the information they needed by February to write this report. So there hasn't been as many requests for information, there hasn't been as many interviews. So I don't want to speak to her, she can certainly answer that question herself. I'm sure she'll get it. But to my knowledge, it seems that there hasn't been any like concerns that have continued about getting information. So we'll see what she says when she answers that question. There's definitely a concern with Chair Zelli immediately following the hearing. And so it's something we've been paying attention to and making sure that we're being as responsive as humanly possible, given the constraints of working on a project and all the demands that entails as well. So, perfect. Thank you.
Sure.
Councilmember Bowen?
Thank you. It's a great question. I will say, just obviously I'm not directly involved with being questioned by the auditor in this particular thing, or the Foley office, but I know this has taken significant staff time, and they've worked really hard to try and be responsive at the same time building the project.
Any other questions for Matt?
No.
All right, seeing no other questions from Matt, we'll move on to the next item. And item number 2 is technology change management. Kevin.
Chair Lee, members of the committee, I'm here to present today on technology change management at the council. So let's start with a little bit of background. So what is the goal of technology change management? Basically, at its best, it's meant to prepare, support, and enable individuals and organizations to execute changes to information hardware and software. So we're looking at systems that generally are used to conduct business day to day. So sometimes it might be a system implementation if we're moving to a new system, system upgrades, and some things as simple as patch management maybe. So our scope was actually all IS change management and change advisory board activities for hardware and software from 2021 to 2022. And we reviewed change management documents, policies, procedures, work instructions, job age, and any other change management tools that might be available. Basic objectives were to determine if the activities and controls related to change management were effective at minimizing business risk and also technology security risks. And also wanted to determine if current activities, controls, and procedures regarding change management follow best practices or certain NIST or CIS guidance with respect to change management. So our observations, one piece that was pivotal or important to note is that the council does not currently have technology change management policies, procedures, or standards that are informed by industry best practices. So this is specific to IT change management. And so, of course, without such things as policies, procedures, or IT standards, change management controls could fail to manage risks that could lead to higher costs, greater downtime, or project delays. And another example, or another observation that we had, this was specific to the Change Advisory Board. The Change Advisory Board does not have a formal authority, and so the defined roles and responsibilities of Change Advisory Board weren't really there for change management activities. Without a defined authority, of course, a lack of clear roles and responsibilities can prevent the council from meeting business and security objectives. And without CAB reviews and approvals, the council could be exposed to operational risks that could include system functionality issues or also unmanaged technology vulnerabilities. So maybe a little bit of background. I know the CAB, it is probably important to note there was a draft procedure that was created at some point in time, but I think with the amount of turnover we've had in IS and various other pieces, it has never made its way to being a formally approved procedure. So I give you that context, but maybe looking a little bit more at the conclusions. Technology changes at the council are currently not executed by a formal process to identify, document, and control changes. Our recommendations really centered around senior management and helping senior management to establish policies and procedures that can be used to implement technology standards that would be informed by industry-leading practices. And of course, the goal is that management supports the effort to promote risk mitigation, ensures that most of that is really just to ensure that technology is adding value to the organization, helping us meet our objectives, and change management at its best is really the thing that helps us do that through technology. So maybe see if there are any questions.
Are there any questions? Committeemember Jones.
Thank you, Chair Lee. Congratulations on your new certification.
Thank you.
Love that. So kind of going back to the questions around the policies and, trying to kind of develop some of those policies. So I remember distinctly a year, maybe 2 years ago, you were really excited about a hire that you had. Somebody was going to come and help us transition to NIST. And I'm looking past you to the gentleman over here. It sounds like there are quite a few vacancies and things like that within IT, and you had spoken about the woman who was here who got hired away for a significantly higher salary. So I guess my question more to management here is, have you considered, rather than trying to do all this internally, have you considered possibly contracting the policy formation and things like that out, kind of looking at other alternatives to getting this work done rather than just trying to do everything internally?
Chair Lee, Councilmember Guptan. Yes, we have actually. So we currently have a contract with a third-party entity, IT Audit Labs is the name of the company, helping us develop our policy procedure around information security. There are some foundational policy procedure and standards that are slightly more pressing, and so they're towards the front of our list and are within our capability to execute. At the moment, we would have a hard time implementing a change management policy or procedure due to lack of capacity within our operating areas. So we could create the framework to follow, but I don't think we'd be capable of following it at the moment.
Thank you. Committeemember Nelson.
Thank you, Chair Lee. So, and that kind of raises a question to me, Craig, and that kind of so think about the scope though first for the audit. So was it really looking at the change management, governance, policy, procedures that are in place, or did you get into some of the operational type things like, are changes being approved before they're moved to production, separate test environments, those types of standard controls?
Yeah, yep, and if we go back, we did actually include in the scope all council divisions. So really what we started was, we started with meeting with the chair of the Change Advisory Board, kind of talking through their process, learned that things were a little bit less documented, approvals were a little bit less documented, learned that not everything maybe flows through the Change Advisory Board. So at that point, we decided it was necessary to have more not pointed conversations, but more coordinated conversations with people involved with change management at the division level. So we went out to Metro Transit, knew a little bit more about MTS, so we didn't talk with them as much, went to environmental services and a couple areas with environmental services and just tried to talk through what their processes and procedures were. And again, we found that there were very few documented process steps, documented approvals, documented test schemes, not test schemes, but there wasn't documented testing and documented approval before rollout in a lot of cases. So we started under the maybe traditional model and then realized things being a little bit less solid in the traditional way. We went out and talked to everyone about what they were doing to some extent. So, but there again, we didn't have documented procedures at the division level or at the unit level in some cases, which leads us to where we are here, so.
As part of the remediation then for these issues, would you expect that there would not only be the policies and procedures be implemented and designed, but those would actually be in an operational capacity that you really wouldn't be able to do the tests and approvals, et cetera, to your point earlier, Chief Information Officer Vance?
Certainly, that would be our shared aspiration. I think slotting that into the body of work in front of us is the challenge.
So, and then just briefly, so this is in the details and I can talk to you about it later, but under the limitations of scope within the report, there's just a sentence here that said significant barriers analyzing user administration activities due to lack of activity documentation. So I'm not sure if that was a typo or could you help me understand how the user administration activities tied to the change management piece?
Yeah. Well, so what I think that is referencing is that there is a ticketing system that is used by the council for the purposes of change management that runs through IS and runs through the Change Advisory Board. That particular system and the use of it for change management is what that line is sort of referencing. So user administration being within that ticketing system, within the scope of changes that run through the Change Advisory Board, there are a very small number of things, and the usage of the system and the change tickets within that system isn't very standard. So, you know, I tried to create a sentence that could capture all of that, and it didn't probably, but yeah, there is a ticketing system. It is being used, but it's not necessarily being used in the traditional format you might expect, and so the user administration piece is about the users who even have access to a change ticket in that system, and what an approval means in that system is sort of difficult to.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Shirley, and maybe Matt, I'm wondering how you're selecting your audit projects in the IT space. Are you engaging in a separate sub-risk assessment process? I'm just hearing I'm not surprised with the results given likely your other priorities. So are we, from an audit perspective, are we a little bit ahead of, where we maybe should be when we're doing audit work? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. Chairly, members of the committee, I had the same thought as we've kind of had several of these projects come up, and it becomes an ambitious state, right? And we are where we are. What's on the audit plan going forward, we had a series of these type of audits that were on the plan, I think, going back about 2 years, but I think we felt we would be in a different place now. What we have is a little bit more tactical IT projects. We're going to talk about the video components of body cam and cash room. We've got IDASH, which I don't think I ever answered the question, what is IDASH? I don't even know what the acronym means, but it's our, Metro Transit has a system that has a whole series of HR functions that they just use for interfaces with other systems within the council. An e-builder, which is a system that is for the project. So it's a little bit less, we're getting more tactical in terms of what we're selecting in the short-term plan going forward, and less so on some of these bigger picture issues, although not that we don't think it's important, but I think to your point, if our results are not able to be actionable within a certain period of time, then there's really not much point in issuing the report. So.
Any other questions?
Just a comment on that, Matt. I somewhat disagree with your statement. I think it's important for internal audit to be forward-looking, and so I think there is still value in an audit. Like, even if the results are not immediately actionable, I think it reminds management that there is a goal to reach for, and I think it's important to point that out. So
fair point.
Councilmember Brewer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to follow that up. I think that it's almost, instead of really being an audit, it's a gap analysis. It's seeing all the things that are missing that we need to do, and I think change management across the different divisions, not just with IT, is something that's a process that should be built in, and I think this just really highlights that.
Wholeheartedly agree with that statement. I think part of the reason this is important is that we need to develop change management, and we didn't say it, but like across the council for all projects, not just IT projects. So.
Any other questions or comments? All right. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next item is contract administration. We have Tunde Larson.
Chair Lee, members of the committee, my name is Aimee, and I'm here with Tim and Kevin to talk to you about contract administration. So a little bit about the background about this presentation. We did 2 concurrent contract administration audits. You'll see the first one is consulting and contractual services, and the second one is information services. For our scope, we selected contracts that were executed between January 1st, 2019 and June 30th, 2022. The entire dollar value of that scope or that universe was $3.5 billion. If you look at the table below, just for some extra context on the value of each of our audits, consulting and contractual services was $265.4 million, and then information services was $67 million. So for both of these audits, our objectives were to determine if the council's contract managers are using best practices to manage contracts, if contract deliverables are provided on time and within the scope of the contract, to determine if the contractor was paid on time and according to the contract terms, to determine if amendments and change orders are implemented according to procedures and/or the contract's terms, and then finally to determine if contract managers are closing out contracts in accordance with the council's procedures. So now I'll hand it off to Tim and Kevin to talk about observations.
So we had a handful of observations. And the first one being is that the council may be liable for interest on late invoice payments. So we originally started with 43 invoices that we sampled. We found that about a third of those were paid late. That kind of prompted us to go, let's look at a few more. So we took all the invoices that were paid in 2021 and for the first 3 quarters of 2022. We did the analysis and found that roughly about 10% of the time we're paying late or we're paying on time, 90%, depending on how you want to phrase that. So the risk here is that obviously there's a financial risk with late invoice and paying that interest, as well as reputational risk, as well as there's potential concern with some of the subcontractors and particularly the DVEs who are reliant on getting paid in a timely manner. The second finding that we had was that there were a number of issues with documentation or billing. So this included things like we were being on one contract double billed for a few line items for I think 3 quarters before it was figured out that we were being double billed and was corrected. There were some issues with mobilization fees and getting charged multiple times for that. Documentation issues being poor scans and missing descriptions on line items for invoices. So again, risk being, it's hard to determine whether or not the expenses are within the scope if we can't read the document or if there's no description on the line item. And then a reputational and financial risk for not enforcing contract requirements. The next finding that we had, contractors and vendors are not always being notified when a PM has left the council. There was a relatively new process that procurement put into place in, I believe, August. So that was kind of our scope for us from August going forward. We did still find a number of PMs who had left, but the contractors or vendors had not been notified. And that causes an issue because the vendors or the contractors may not know who to go to with questions and may cause project delays. And then finally for this one, there was no standard process for contract closeout. There were bits and pieces of like what to do, but no standard, like here's what everybody needs to do for contract closeout. And that was, again, a recommendation or a best practice that we found from NASPO, National Association of State Procurement Officials. So the risk being there might be remaining funds on an open PO or a contract that may be improperly used, or we might not get all the deliverables or close out invoices, what have you.
All right. So we also did a separate but concurrent IS contract administration audit, and maybe just a little bit of context for that. In this case, we are speaking that $67 million is really contracts that are in the IS budget. So we kind of learned from change management, IS is a somewhat distributed function, but we concentrated specifically on the IS budgeted contracts. So another feature of that is that the council participates in the cooperative purchasing venture program. So a lot of contracts that are negotiated by the state of Minnesota through the Department of Administration are contracts that we ride for a lot of IT purchases, system purchases, service purchases, and such. And in those cases, we don't necessarily issue a contract, but write a state contract. So those are some pieces to keep in mind as we talk through this. An additional thing was that we didn't want to replicate the exact same findings as the other audits. So we tried to concentrate a little bit more on some of the what and how of things. And in doing so, we came to find that the processes for creating purchase orders created some complexity in the classification of IS goods and services. And so here we're looking at, deliverables or milestones may not accurately reflect the goods or services that we're purchasing in some cases. So when we're creating the POs, some of the documentation from vendor pricing may not easily match to a PO. And so in those cases, it's a little bit harder to figure out how the PO was created or what was behind some of the lines. There's a risk of delays due to purchase order changes or issues attributing work to a purchase order. And then, of course, without documentation about any of the issues, we can't perform lessons learned activities. So sort of looking at the second leg of the journey in contracting, invoice processing and WAM receiving issues led to issues determining expense reasonableness and also could have contributed to late payment process or late payments. And so the WAM system, maybe take a moment to note systems here. We were looking at IS purchases. So we have the PeopleSoft system, which issues a PO and is used for paying invoices, but we also have the WAM system, which is used for issuing a PO and receiving goods. So issues are contributed to because of the number of systems involved in this particular process. So you have to receive something in the WAM system, information has to match, and then there's actually a third system that an invoice would run through before a payment is processed. And so system information has to be fairly exact and set up and ready to go. And so there were some issues in WAM receiving in a third system separate from the payment system and separate from the invoice processing system. So, of course, this can lead to difficulty in documenting expense reasonableness if invoices lack details on the deliverables or milestones. And it may be difficult to align work with the PO if the invoices lack supporting documentation or lack information as to what goods or services help you align things on the PO level. So.
And then just to wrap things up, so again, with the documentation issues and some of the inconsistencies we noted with invoice processing and contract management practices, it does open the council up to various risks, namely, again, financial and reputational. And most of our recommendations kind of centralize around the thought of the council should standardize and better document the tasks that are involved with contract management, invoice review, and payments.
And we also noted, contract administrators need to know what goods or services are being received and what are the market prices, markups, discounts, so that we're able to know that information and apply it when we're creating POs and paying invoices. And then also the council should ensure that POs are tied directly to vendor pricing and that vendor invoices are easy to understand with supporting documentation. With that, we'll open for any questions.
Committee members, do you have any questions? Committee member Nelson?
Thank you, Chair Lee. So again, clarification on the scope specifically related to the IS contracts. So I noted in here you mentioned that you're confirming compliance with various information security standards like NIST, et cetera. So were there situations where you actually confirmed third-party reviews for technology controls, whether that be through a third-party attestation or those types of things, or was it really just on the processing of the contract?
Chair Lee, Councilman Gillespie, we attempted a review of third-party risk reviews and risk management. At the beginning of the engagement, there was a plan to implement a few factors that might have to do with reviewing SSA 18 reports or some other third-party attestations of vendor controls, and that was never implemented. So we were unable to really review third-party risk management as there isn't a program per se to review. So we were not able to incorporate that. We tried to review what we could, but most of the contracts in sample were also historical. So we started this in about July of 2022 when they were about to implement a procedure, but all of the contracts were from June 2022 back to January of 2019. So none of them would have fallen under the incipient or growing program. So we weren't able to really do very much. And from that time, from 2019 through June of 2022, there was no process in place to review third-party risk. So.
Okay, so follow up.
Yep, go ahead.
And then, so just to clarify, so there is either software as a service being used or data being stored elsewhere, or vendors who have access to our data, but we don't have the procedures and policies in place yet for reviewing their security controls, et cetera. So would that, if I'm understanding that correctly, would that be covered then in a future audit, or would that be put onto the kind of audit universe? And maybe this is a question for Auditor LaTour.
Chair Lee, Councilmember Gillespie, we have that in mind for risk assessment, definitely. And I know we're in continuous communication with the IS department about what sorts of things are happening with the security team. I don't know if there are any plans that they have, or what. I know we plan to consider it in risk assessment, definitely. But yeah.
Better in minds.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilmember Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I find this one concerning. It's really important. And as a consultant, small business owner, you're pretty dependent on people paying their invoices. And so when this process is tied to the PO system and the matching up the invoices and contracting and all these independent systems that aren't talking to each other, these are things that the private sector really has kind of figured out, and it feels like we should maybe look at what's working. I think, I don't have an answer for you today, but I think it's something that we should talk to Councilmember Johnson to get on the management committee work plan, because I think this is kind of a big deal.
Chair Lee, I invited Jody Jacoby to come today too. I think that, well, I'll let her speak to this, but the procurement department is starting a contract management unit. And I thought it important after what we just heard with the findings to sort of flip to where what we're doing to address in terms of, some of the findings, at least, not all of it, so she kind of speak to
Thank you. Chair Lee, committee members, my name is Jody Jacoby. I'm the director of the procurement department. And just to talk a little bit in respect to some of the work that procurement is doing council-wide for contract management. It started about a year ago where we had one staff assigned to supplement and support existing contract management. And within this year, we've added a second person. But just to give you perspective, in 2022, there were 584 new contracts executed, not purchase orders, but just new contracts as a result of either bids or competitive solicitations, and 132 amendments. And then this year, in the first quarter of 2023, we've had already 49 amendments. And so the intent of this contract management support unit is to supplement and support project managers in the field, and to help with some of the projects that they're working on now is what you talked about, Councilmember Barber, standardized invoices. Also looking at how purchase orders are set up to make sure that they're easy to receive, to make sure that the invoicing is understood and the project manager clearly defined. And our mighty staff of 2 have made some really good efforts thus far, but there's a lot of work to do. And additionally, the technology piece, I'm so glad that you mentioned it. Our staff are working in 10 different systems to piece together the information. And the council has a very large project called BPSI, which is Business Process System Integration. All right. And procurement is one of the first projects moving forward in that suite, if you will, of 9 projects. But we need some technology to create efficiencies and accountability and do this work better. We also know that some higher level oversight outside of the business unit, again, we're not going to be out with hard hats and steel-toed boots overseeing contracting process, but a different set of eyes making sure that they're doing their independent analysis, that they're looking at the scope of work the specifications that were originally issued are being managed and maintained. Working through vendor disputes, that staff is bringing forward a policy and a procedure to help even debar vendors. The council never had a debarment process. So there is a lot of work happening, and there's a lot more work that can be done. And right now, there is a total of 1,200 active contracts right now. So again, a staff of 2, we're just really dipping our toes in the water to see what we can do, but we know that there long-term are some better solutions for accountability and transparency to identify some of these gaps. We're also having better conversations. This contracts management unit is providing me regular reports where our CIO, Craig Vance, and I just met last week and talked about some state contracts where we weren't sure if we were actually getting the services that the vendor committed to us. And so that unit is developing, our contract management unit is partnering with IS, and they're doing an all-staff training to train from how do you prepare a scope of work. The purchasing agent who's setting up the contract is going to explain how the lines in the purchase order are set up, talk about the invoicing, what are the expectations, what are the expectations for timely review so we're not paying late fees, and then some of the closeout items. We're looking at price increases. We are using a lot of different indices to help not only with the existing management, but future planning. But there's a lot of work to be done. The unit, again, of 2, held a training in April, and there were 72 council employees that attended. And so that is really good support as well. And our next training is, I believe, July 20th. And we'll send out an invitation. And if you are interested, we would welcome that you attend as well. But we're certainly learning and taking some of the insight and really great partnership with our internal audit team to have a better insight on strategy from cradle to grave, because we know that's an area that at the council we can do better on.
Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, thanks for your presentation. We'll go into the 4th item, which is MnDOT funding agreements.
Good afternoon, Chair Lee and members of the committee. My name is Brynna Bargfield. Some of the other auditors who worked on this are here. So at the end, if we have any questions that we need to direct them, I can pull them up, but I'll be running through this, trying to get through and respect your time as well. So you just heard about contract administration audits. The audit that we did of agreements with MnDOT was in a similar vein to these, but because MnDOT is another government entity and there can be some unique roles of federal and state funding involved in that, as well as some of these agreements involving different divisions or lasting a very long time. We looked at this one specifically on its own as well. Some of the observations and findings, we saw good examples of collaboration and cost saving working with the state. We also saw process improvement over time. So, for example, some outdated contract structures that we observed in our sample are no longer being used. Procurement also switched to digital signatures as another example. However, of our findings, there is room to clarify some roles and responsibilities, and you see that reflected in our recommendations to create and update work instructions, streamline processes when possible, and again, as you've seen, we've been working on contract administration. We can continue to incorporate this into future risk assessments and upcoming projects as well. Going into this, we had 3 main objectives: looking at compliance with the master funding agreement, as well as inclusion of federal clauses in contracts, reviewing invoices for correct account strings, documented expenses, making sure expenses were allowable, prompt payment, and confirming that contract budgets were followed. There were two main findings from here. The first was looking at account strings on invoices. So from our sample, there were 4 invoices where account strings mismatched in some way between the invoice and the NOGA. NOGA standing for Notice of Grant Agreement. It's a document used to track spending on grants and keep track of what different types of expenses are allowable under different account strings. On 3 of the invoices that had errors, there were incorrect cover sheets. These were submitted by a vendor using a cover sheet for one division when the invoice was for a project in the other division. And so it had the incorrect account strings listed on there. We were able to confirm through conversations with MTS Finance that the account strings were corrected before the final payment was made. For the invoice that had a partial mismatch, this came down to the org/department code, so it was part of the internal accounting features. And that mismatch we attribute to being able to track the history of NOGA revisions and the date effective for those over time, because some of the other NOGAs for that same project had been revised. From that, our recommendations, adding a date effective to NOGA revisions so that we can better track those over time, over the life of the document, and clarifying and documenting roles and responsibilities in MTS Finance for invoice review. Our second finding, I present to you a decision chart for determining how long you need to retain an invoice. As you can see, the division that an invoice is attached to matters, the type of federal program it might be pulling money from matters, whether or not it's a grant matters, and ultimately there can be lots of variation in how long an invoice needs to be retained. And that is not practical for our electronic systems to keep all of those as active records for the entire length. So one of the things that we ran into happened when an invoice that we had in our sample was archived during our testing. We were able to find a copy of that invoice through speaking with project managers. We were able to find payment information as well after talking to other people and requesting that information. But this is something that we found that we hadn't expected when we originally went into it. From this, our recommendations include streamlining the retention schedules where possible and improving information on how to access the archive. So when I mentioned that that invoice was archived during our testing, it still was present as information somewhere in the system, but when we used the standard search procedures to find the invoice, it was no longer in that active search. It was then in an archive table in the system. So improving the information on how to search the archive or how to find invoice images for invoices that are archived is what that second recommendation here addresses. From that, I open it up for any questions.
Questions from committee members?
All right.
Well, fantastic. Thanks for your presentation. We'll go on to the.
Yeah, the last one should be pretty quick, so I think we can.
Our final report is MTPD property.
I'm clicking through and I'm not seeing it.
It's okay, we could probably
There we go.
Yeah.
Just give Greg a second. Figure it out.
Okay.
on the top.
There we go. Let's go.
Here we are.
Chair, members of the audit committee, I first wanted to introduce myself. My name is Sydney. I'm one of the new associate auditors. I'm happy to be presenting here for the first time today with Brynna, and we are going to be discussing the MTPD property room audit that we conducted this past March.
So the MTPD property room is a storage facility operated by the Metro Transit Police Department. It contains a variety of evidence, including, for example, narcotics, cash, and other evidence related to crimes. Some of the key risks that come with the property room that we identified are legal and reputational risks from any possible theft, tampering, or misplacement of any evidence. So why we decided to do this work this year, previously we had done annual audits, but this was suspended due to COVID-19 pandemic. Our last audit had been in 2019 when there was a new facility move, and that was actually a 100% audit. There was also recent staff turnover and an increased focus on public safety and policing, so we decided that it was a good time to revisit the property room. Just generally, we found that the system of controls was working as intended, and we had no findings and no recommendations, but we did have some observations, which we'll discuss in a moment.
In past years, when we've audited the property room, our focus was the same as the primary objective here, confirming that property room items are in the correct location as indicated in the inventory system. This year, we also decided to add 2 secondary objectives. Those were reviewing physical access controls, so how does someone actually enter the facility, and assessing policies and procedures on asset forfeiture.
So here is our inventory results. So in order to confirm, or in order to test our primary objective, we generated a random sample, a stratified random sample by location of approximately 2,000 items out of the 44,000 items in the audit universe. Of those 2,000 items, we found all items. There are a couple exceptions noted at the bottom. These items were located or had chain of custody reports. They are exceptions for being in the wrong location on the one hand, so being in the wrong shelf, for instance. But that, again, was corrected during testing. And also for being donated prior to the onsite. These did have chain of custody reports. It just wasn't entered into the system as having been donated, but that was also corrected during our onsite. So given those exceptions, that represents a 1% error rate, which is in line with our past audits that we have previously been conducting annually. And so we determined that the system of control is working as intended.
Looking at the secondary objectives for access controls when reviewing badge access logs, we found no instances of unauthorized access being granted, and any items that we had concerns with, we were able to discuss with MTPD and resolve those, also determining that they were not instances of unauthorized access. And then finally, looking at the forfeiture policy, we compared that to the state model policy on forfeiture, and found that the MTPD policy contained all the required components and had sufficient levels of detail to meet those requirements.
Any questions?
Thank you, Chair Lee. So, a question related to scoping and IT. So for this review, I appreciate the review of the access logs into the room, but for the inventory system itself, did we look at any of the controls related to logging and monitoring related to changes to that inventory system or the user access to that system? Where, just to telegraph what I'm thinking here, I worry about someone being able to adjust the log, remove an item, and then who would know about that? So did we do some work in order to cover that, please?
Chair Lee, Committee Member Gillespie. Although that wasn't part of our objectives when we went in, we mentioned that there were some chain of custody reports for items. And we don't have any representatives from MTPD here who can speak more directly on that, but from my memory of the chain of custody reports we reviewed, those did include audit log information. So if an item was listed as moved or removed from the property room, it would keep track of who entered that.
Any other questions? All right, thank you for your report. That brings us,
Yeah, Chair Lee, members of the committee, as
far as our next scheduled meeting, have Tammy reach out. I just want to thank Jenna for sitting in today and covering for Tammy. She had an unexpected absence today. I'll have her reach out to the committee for, as I spoke about, the legislative audit presentation, find dates for that, the next fall meeting. There was also some interest as I met with all of you, most of you, at the end of the last session about coming up with some sort of a working session or some sort of a where we can learn from external council members. So reach out and think about what that could look like and what the timing, whether it's an afternoon or an evening or what timing works best. I think it'd be valuable. It's been on my mind, but with the transition of new council member, there's been a lot going on, and I showed you the org chart. So, but it's still on my mind, so I'll probably solicit some feedback about that, and also that might be a good opportunity to go over the charters and have some discussions about some of the details. So, so we'll kind of table this item and circle back with the committee members about finding dates, if that's all right with committee members.
All right, thanks, Matt. With that, I will hereby conclude our audit committee today.